We're in Ingrid Murphy's studio in Cardiff on the 17th of September 2018. Thank you, Ingrid.
You're very welcome. You're very welcome.
Work at a very frenetic pace, it seems, for me, looking in.
Yeah.
Would you say that pace informs your work, or does the work you make demand that you work at that sort of pace?
Yes, so I suppose the notion of the pace with the work and the speed at which I have to work is compound factors there, really. One, I don't work in a linear way because I have probably, there could be 10 or 12 stages to any single thing that I'm producing. So it means that I'll be working across a whole series of pieces for a small bit at a time. So if I have to scan something, then I have to 3D print it, then I have to make a mold of that, then I have to cast that, then I have to find the other piece that it's going to be cast with. If it has to have electronics, the electronics have to fit the piece of the so everything in a sense has to be done in a quite a logical way, I suppose, but at the same time I don't have a lot of time. I've got a job that demands a lot of me as well. So when I get time in the studio or get time on the computer, time in the VR studio or in the physical studio, it has to be frenetic, I suppose. Yeah, it is a bit. So everything's kind of planned. So I know if I've got a day, I can do X amount of different tasks across the type of work. So the other night I had to make 7 molds in an evening. So everything's stacked up ready to go. So rather than making a mold and moving on, I kind of go, okay, now I've got to make small molds, but I've got to make 7 now, so I can move to the next stage and the next stage. So everything's compartmentalized into the different processes, and then I end up with loads of objects like you see here, and then the next frenetic thing is trying to fit them all together and figure out that the interactions work in the way they do. And obviously as soon as you start doing that, you begin to realise that maybe that's not what you're thinking, so you have to go back to the drawing board and do it again. So yeah, it is frenetic, but then my mind works like that. Yeah.
You have numerous component parts.
Yeah.
And also, and you touched on there about very demanding work, if you like.
Yeah.
And your making and creative practice, again, for me looking in, seems to cross that academic and home studio sort of not boundary, but life. Well, you just talked about how you sort of have to plan very carefully, but presumably the academic environment informs very much as well, does
hugely,
it? What
yeah.
you're making?
So it's really interesting that some of the things that I will work on academically, and that really interestingly, I suppose, is the majority of my time, the majority of my life has been spent teaching, not making, teaching, to be perfectly honest. So if I'm learning something, so each project I take on, everything that I'm doing, it's about learning for me. So all of the new technologies that I'm working with, or the new processes, it's all in a sense learning to teach. So my making, I don't go and remake work generally. I don't tend to, it's always trying to move forward into new domains, because it's all about making new curriculum. And therefore the academic life, I suppose, is a fantastic stimulus for my creative practice. It also means that I have access to fantastic tools, because the university is very well equipped, and obviously I use Fab Lab, and because I want our students to use digital fabrication tools, I need to be well versed in them myself. So it's sort of the shifting needs of making as a culture across society, and the ability to be able to teach that at an appropriate level for graduates means that my own skill set has to constantly evolve. And then that constantly brings new tools or new processes to my own practice. So I think I'd find it very hard to be a sole practitioner in a studio and not part of the academic structure, in a sense. And also that constant thing, if you're teaching creativity, you're immersed in it all the time, and you're bouncing ideas around all the time, and you're getting critical feedback. And And you're also working in a transdisciplinary way, so you're beginning to see the impact of how the technologies you might use might have impact in another field or vice versa. And that's fascinating, and it sort of gives you a view of how people might view craft practice or ceramic practice from outside as well. So you're in no vacuum, and I think that becomes really fascinating. So the academic side of it, I suppose, you also have to reflect and write about it, so you have to theorise what you're doing. And again, there's a huge level of accountability with that in terms of academic responsibility. So it's not so much that you can just make it, you have to be able to contextualise it and in a sense critically defend it as well. So that makes it quite interesting as well. That helps support the practice and inform the practice.
And you spoke there about it drawing on many different disciplines, if you like, and lines of inquiry. But your work, to me, is also very playful. So it's full of inquiry, but lovely, playful tone. How do you find that you hone into one specific, or maybe you don't? So when you start on a new piece, have you honed into one specific question or one line of inquiry, or is it all still exploratory as you go?
It's pretty exploratory as I go, but in a sense, if you think about this body of work, it's the seen and the unseen. So the inquiry is about eliciting what can be unseen in an object. So we have the object, we perceive the object, but what can we maybe experience from that object in a way that might not be seen? So how can we use the other senses? How can we use the material characteristics of ceramics itself? It's the conductivity of the gold or the translucency of the bone china. So that becomes the point of inquiry, and then you begin to push that in different ways. And I suppose the really interesting thing is, for me, there's that love, that absolute love of the domestic object. So this idea that you can use something so commonplace to explore something that has a different level of potency. And the fact that people know these domestic objects, these plates, these teapots, these little chai cups, whatever they might be, they're not objects of gravitas. They're not, what would we call them? What's the term? Can't remember. They're ropographic objects. They're objects of little worth. And the idea of getting them to do something that might push our understanding of objects or ceramics as a practice or clay as a material a little bit further, then that would be the point of inquiry. To do that playfully, to allow for an engagement that might be entertaining of some kind, I think is just common good practice to try and communicate to people. Humour communicates well, and I think if they're playful, then people will engage with them more, and they might. It's about getting them to stop scanning, isn't it, and stop and look and engage with an object a bit more. And playfulness is that, and I suppose it's storytelling, isn't it? The objects tell their stories, and technologies allow me to make them speak a little bit more or add a different voice.
Makes them very human.
Yeah, makes them human. Yes, humanises the object. But they must do that in a unthreatening way, I think. Yeah, commonplace objects allowing us to engage with other, then you can see the potentials of what technologies can do with commonplace objects. It's interesting, isn't it? Because even like if you think about some of the most significant movements in art history, like Cubism and things like that, when they wanted to really modify objects, they used the base objects. They use teacups. They use the most easily recognizable objects are the ones that are used to transform our perception of the world around us.
So objects are really important to you. So you choose, or you seem to choose your objects very, very specifically for a lot of different reasons that you've outlined. And people, when they're talking about ceramics and different ceramic genre and be it sculptural, domestic, studio, there's a lot of talk of function and form, and this body of work functions, has a functionality. They're not in the traditional sense that audiences might expect. So for you, does the function what might shape that piece of work? Is it the function or the form, because you know that there's a piece of work that you want to, or an object you want to work with?
It's not so much about the form. Obviously the visual aesthetics are really quite important, but it'll be really interesting about, so there's two things, isn't there? There's the material itself and the material culture of the object. So for example, you have a chai cup taken from the streets of Jaipur, a broken chai cup. Now that chai cup has its own history. I haven't cast it and replicated it. These are the original found objects. And what's really interesting for me about that is that, you know, these objects, you touch them and they play sound, but these objects have lived in those streets where that sound occurred. And energy goes somewhere, sound waves go somewhere. So somewhere within the material historicity of this cup will be that sound. So there's this sense of kind of new materialism, that the material itself has its own vibrancy. So sometimes that's why I specifically use found objects as opposed to always replicating the objects, because you can't, in a sense, replicate the historicity of that material. And I think the interesting thing about the function, in a sense, is yes, most of these objects will have been produced at some time to perform a different function as to what they're now doing. So for me, they become representations of that function rather than that function in itself. And therefore, we read them differently. We don't read a broken chai cup as a functional object. We read it as a representation of a chai cup. So therefore, I think it becomes really interesting as to why you select the objects and what's important about the objects. And to me, it's like the jug over here and the thing from Things Men Have Made with Wakened Hands is I couldn't make an object that had the tactility and historicity of this old jug. I couldn't. So all I could do was bring people's attention to it by creating a piece that made us experience it through an augmented way. Whether that succeeds or not is a different thing, but it's still about connectivity to that material and that object. It's not about trying to remake that object. It's about changing our perception of that object in its first instance. So I think that's a kind of an odd difference about I'm not making functional objects, and in the sense but I am using functional objects to make non-functional statements. That makes sense.
Perfectly.
Yeah.
And you mentioned there about the materiality.
Yeah.
And the materiality of clay and of ceramics, of course, you know very well, and is very specific. It's a bit simplistic to ask what is it about clay you enjoy using, but what is it about clay that you still enjoy using, actually, after many years of ceramic practice?
I think it's an oldie but a goodie. It's complete malleability, and the fact that it's this alchemical process that you take something and something that is fluid or something that is plastic, and you change its chemical composition and you turn it into something that's inert and enduring forever, and that will never. Like the joy of opening the kiln, especially after a lustre firing, and you look in and everything's shining out at you, you know, and these things didn't exist before you thought them up and put processes together to make them happen. And I think this act of poiesis, of bringing something forth into the world that didn't exist, that's quite thrilling. And in ceramics, you do it, and you know, there's a 3,000-year-old pot over there. It's going to endure. So there's that thing of endurance to do with ceramics. And also I think its capabilities, again, like the conductivity of the gold luster is extraordinary. The translucency of bone china, because it's got bone in it, it's amazing when you think about it. And then the insulation powers of clay itself. Yesterday, I was trying to get a circuit board to work, and I thought it was broken, but I had clay dust on my fingers, because clay and electronics don't work together well, and it was insulating my touch. So that pure kind of chemistry of it, it's never-endingly amazing to me, I suppose, what it can do. And I limit my range of practice and I limit my palette because it's, it can go. But to look at what people can do when they're, wood firing and things like that, where you literally are painting with fire, you're painting with the elements. Yeah, it's an enduring love, really, ceramics, and you never get to the end of it, I think. And it's a tough taskmaster because, things blow up, you drop them on the floor, whatever, and you sit there weeping over a pile of shards, wishing you were a filmmaker. But, then you go back and you make it again, and you do something different,
So it's the alchemy as well, you touched on, of ceramics that intrigues you constantly as well, and it's that thrill. Do you also see the alchemy, which some audience or visitors will, people who see this body of work, alchemy of the technology side? Does that intrigue you?
Yes.
Or challenge you in a different way?
Yes, I think, I don't see much difference, actually. In the world of bits and atoms, I think they're pretty much interconnected nowadays. So I think that for me, the kind of alchemy of technology is one of the really interesting things about working with electronics or physical computing and things like that, is that it demystifies the black box for you. You break the black box open and you'll see that basically inside there is very similar to the same processes that I use in ceramics. It's still like craft processes to build handmade electronics. You're still soldering, you're still working with raw materials. I think there's a real interesting comparison, I think, to be made there. And let's not forget, all ceramics is technology, and we only tend to call it technology if it's invented after we were born. So I think we need to maybe rephrase our understanding of technology, but by using things that essentially technology with plugs on them that I might use in this work, it enables me to maybe access connectivity between objects, hacking objects, augmenting objects. These are all technological terms. Smart objects, and to be able to bring this technological lexicon and technological processes to the world of ceramic craft is a really interesting juxtaposition. So if people come and find the notion of alchemy and the technology interesting, that's great. But the technology should be subservient to the idea. It shouldn't exist just because it can. It should be there because it's actually enabling something that couldn't happen otherwise. So, yeah. The tyranny of digital enchantment. That's one of the issues that we have to deal with when we deal with new technologies. And it's easy to be seduced by the capabilities. But, it's very grounding when you have to stick it in a piece of ceramics. But yeah. And it's exactly the same, I think, in any technology. It's the same in ceramics, how you can be seduced by some of the technological abilities within clay as well.
Once you dissect them all as you've had to do,
yeah,
I guess
it's all the same.
So of all the pieces in this show,
yeah,
could you pick out one, or maybe you couldn't, one or two that you could talk us through a little bit, the sort of the technical side, or what's been the most technically challenging, that's frustrated you the most, but you've kept dissecting and found the solution?
So there's interesting ones. I suppose one of the more innovative pieces is working with Aidan Taylor on the development of the IoT hand. And this is producing a hand which you touch and it illuminates. It's a bone china hand, and you place your hand upon it. And as you touch it, it illuminates. And it also illuminates another hand that was in my home. So I know if somebody's engaging with my work in the studio. So this idea of connecting. So one is in the JKK Museum in India, and the other one would be here. One would be in various venues as I'd be exhibiting for the show. So each time somebody engages with this piece of work as the show is on tour, I will know. It will illuminate in my house. I can't provide feedback to that person. They're doing it on blind trust. So the interesting thing, I suppose, is that is using pretty high-tech IoT, Internet of Things technology, and not only that, but it's about actually getting the hand cast thin enough to be translucent, to be able to have the conductivity of the gold enough and contact to trigger the electronics, to be able to create housings for the electronics to sit within the hand and not obscure the translucency. So there's one whole technical side of things, but then it's actually fitting all of these things together and making them robust for a physical interaction is really interesting. So it's on paper it looked really easy, and in practice it was quite tricky. You know, and you're dealing with compound things. You're trying to deal with Wi-Fi protocols across different continents, you know, just to make these things work. But it's amazing because you touch a hand and it illuminates. The message goes 6,000 miles to a garage in Newport and 6,000 miles back again instantaneously. That's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. And the idea that people are actually using some of the most sophisticated means in the world to communicate by touching a ceramic object excites me. I don't know why. It's banal and it's pointless, but at the same time it's quite fun and it gets people touching objects. I think that one proved really taxing. I think the other technologies are pretty straightforward. Touch capacitance sensing, 360-degree live streaming. That's a tricky one to, you know, for the inside of the teapot. Yeah, and now trying to put audio files onto plates. That's a tricky one. That might be the holy grail. But most of it's pretty proven now, I think. Yeah. And I've got great, like collaborating with John Pigott on the captain's teapot and the campanologist teacup here. You know, they've got him and Aidan. They've got really good technological skills, so I've got great minds and fingers and soldiers to work with. I wouldn't be able to do it independently. That's why collaboration is so important. Some of it I can, but not all. Not the high tech stuff.
And have you devised some of the pieces in collaboration, or have you brought an idea to the table to collaborators?
In the instance of the campanologist teacup, that was a collaborative process from the outset. Yeah, we started with a cup, and the piece grew from that. At other times, it's that I need to have technical assistance to realise an idea that I've got. So there's different types of collaboration. Sometimes I'm just using people's technical services. Other times it really is a proper integrated collaborative process, and I really enjoy that. That's really interesting because that brings different minds to bear on things. Yeah, from the outset.
Connectivity seems really important to you on so many levels. So collaborating, but that connection to the past, that academic connections, that connecting to objects, that connectivity across the board. Would you say that's the greatest influence in your...
Yes, absolutely. The idea, communicate. That's all. That's all you want to... It's that to me, if I can communicate and connect to anybody, any half-formed thought, anything, then that's what it is for me. It's that ability to communicate through objects, to connect people through objects that we're very familiar with. Connect them to a place, connect them to a sound, connect them to a material, connect them to their own memories, their own evocations. I use a lot of old objects, I want people to to feel that link with time, that link with history, connect them to their own histories, connect them to imagined histories. Yeah, it's definitely about forging connections any which way I can.
And Grumpy Dog.
Oh yeah,
Grumpy Dog. Because in some ways, Grumpy Dog encapsulates some of that in terms of connecting to the past, and you've been taking Grumpy Dog physically around the world.
Yeah.
Have you found Grumpy Dog a good catalyst for communication?
Fantastic. And this is the interesting thing, is like Grumpy Dog, yes, it's a dog, you take it around. It's like people say, oh, it's like the gnome out of Emily, you know, it's that idea. Yes, it is, but it's also I think something else as well, because Grumpy Dog in himself, he's an interesting artifact. One, he's got that fantastic grumpy face, but two, he is an icon of the first industrial revolution. And I think that becomes really quite interesting. People recognise the object. British people recognise the object because they all had one. But when you take it away, they see it as a cultural British icon. And it's really fascinating because it allows you, objects allow you to have conversations at a different level than if you have an object, you can suddenly, you have something to speak to, you have something to speak about, and people embrace it and they engage with it. And I'm really fascinated at kind of the hilarious following he's already managed to accrue, because it's also humour, but people identify that sort of that sense of humour, and he is an ambassador, I suppose, and it's a bit like a proxy. Sometimes it's using an object instead of yourself, isn't it? You have this ability to be able to sort of say, oh, look at this, and look what he's done, look what he's seen, and look what he's doing, and this idea that these objects were made, and most of them sit on shelves and gather dust for, you know, in his case, 150 years. So this idea that now he's emancipated off the mantelpiece, and you can go and scan his replicas to follow his adventures, or have an object that has reiterative engagements. And by getting other people to work on their versions of Grumpy Dog as well, allows us to, in a sense, address other people's associations with the dog, other people's histories, other people's sort of approaches. And I suppose he's a blank as well, isn't he? He says an awful lot, but he can also just be a blank for reinterpretation and reiterative engagement with a singular object. So I don't tire of him, and he still makes me laugh. And also you pull him out in places, and my God, you get some reaction and security alerts, and I've been accused of stealing him from the Getty Centre and all sorts, I was going, he's not a Sev figure, he's from Stoke-on-Trent in the 18th and 19th centuries, so yes, it's quite hilarious what scrapes he's been in. And it's interesting because I think it's a leveler for people, isn't it? Kids can engage with it, anybody can engage with Grumpy Dog. I've got a lovely haiku written for him as well. Somebody wrote him a haiku, which I'll read to you. Yeah. So he becomes, I suppose, a symbolic object.
Is that sort of part of it for you? Just letting the path that you've chosen on that particular day take you wherever it will go? Is that part of the excitement?
Yes. I suppose what's interesting is because I'm doing an awful lot of things for the first time, or a lot of the technologies for the first time, or working in ways, theoretically you think, yes, that's going to work, and then in practice it goes terribly wrong. And what do they say? Never work with children or dogs or technology. But it is that thing of on that journey, you'll find something else. So it might not be the first iteration that ever comes to pass. It might be the second or the third. But sometimes things go terribly wrong. Like my firings this summer just all blew up for no reason that I could understand. And even though I've been doing this for over 30 years, you're just like, really? How did that happen? And you just have to stop and reconsider it and maybe find another way of doing something, and everything has so many variables in the work that we do in ceramics and with technology. There's so many ways in which it can go wrong. You do have to just be a bit zen about it and let it all wash over you, because otherwise you'd be, there's no safe bets. But ceramics teaches you that from day one. You know, you make something and you send it away and it arrives in shards somewhere else and you're like, that's that gone, you know, and it's gone. So I suppose an awful lot of, like, one of the pieces which is all about broken objects, and actually the value in it, there's a value in a broken object as much as there is in an intact object, kind of explores that fragility and that, you know, as I say, you've got like a 3,000-year-old pot there, and it's intact. Well, what's its value if it actually breaks? So there's this, we live with this thing all the time in ceramics of, you know, and because I move studios, like, because I moved my studio from here to France, I'm always chucking half-made things in the boot of a car, or I glaze at work and I cast here, and so my breakages are through the roof. You know, I drive over a speed bump and that's like a week's work gone. You just get so used to it. You just have to go. You make a lot of backups. You learn to make a lot of backups. But yeah, sometimes it can be frustrating. And I see it all the time with students as well. You know, when you see a huge amount of effort and then some kiln firing just means it's all gone. That's hard. There's a grief to that for some people, but you get used to it. For me, I suppose, as soon as the idea has actually been realised, it's kind of done for me. And then if the piece falls off the shelf, I don't really care. Once I've achieved what I've set out to achieve, I don't have a huge value in it after that, to be perfectly honest, which is really odd, but that's the truth.